Hi, welcome to the first part of our lesson 10, which is project risk management. Here we're going to be taking a look at risk and then also taking a look at all the processes that we have under project risk management. So once again, you're welcome. My name still remains Obalin. So risk basically refers to uncertainties. Uncertainties that when they happen can give rise to either a positive or a negative outcome. That's what we refer to as risk. So in this particular knowledge area, by the time we are done, you should be able to know what risk is all about. Then also describe some of the key terms that we use under project risk management. Also learn how to calculate risk. Then identify different categories of risk. And then describe project risk management processes. These are some of the things we shall be taking a look at under project risk management. Okay, let's dive in. So when we talk about risk, remember we said that risk simply refers to an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has positive or negative effect on one or more of project's objectives. So we said that risk basically refers to an uncertain event that, when it happens, can give rise to either a positive or a negative effect on project objectives. So up to 90% of threats identified and investigated in the risk management process can be eliminated by changing how the project work is planned and performed. So the essence of risk management is basically for us to be proactive, so that as much as possible we're able to eliminate or prevent specific risk from happening. So let's say, for example, you're managing a gas pipeline expansion project in Canada. The project funds are allocated in US dollars, even though most of the expenses are in Canadian dollars. Exchange fluctuations are a risk to the project budget. Shortly after the project starts, the Canadian dollar depreciates significantly, which contributes to a budget surplus. This is an example of what we refer to as positive risk. So of course, notice that if the exchange rate drops, then it leads to budget surplus. But then if we, on the other hand, we notice that the exchange rate, let's say the Canadian dollar, for example, increases and does better than the US dollar, then it might begin to affect this project negatively because the project was denominated in the US dollar. So if a major storm delays construction of a commercial office tower, the project timelines may be delayed, and this is an example of what we refer to as negative risk. So under project risk management, there are certain key terms that we use under project risk management. We're going to take a look at some of those key terms. Now, one of the key terms that we use under risk is what we refer to as negative risk. Of course, negative risk is now what we refer to as threat. So in essence, when we mention threat simply refers to the risk or uncertainties that will give rise to a negative impact, while positive risk are known as opportunities. A risk that can only have a negative consequence is called pure risk, while a risk that can have positive and negative consequence is now referred to as business risk. Now, some other key terms we use under project risk management are: we have risk averse. Risk averse refers to someone who doesn't want to be negatively impacted by risk. So anybody who doesn't want to be negatively impacted by risk, we say that that individual is risk averse. So it simply means that this person doesn't like to take risk because he doesn't like, the negative impact of the risk. Then we also have risk tolerance. So this is the level of risk an individual or group is willing to accept or tolerate. And that's what we refer to as the risk tolerance. And then also the risk threshold. So risk threshold is the specific point at which a risk becomes unacceptable. And that's exactly what risk threshold here refers to. So to calculate risk, this is how you calculate risk. Risk can be managed only if they are measured quantitatively. So risk is measured by assigning a monetary value to it, and risk is calculated by multiplying the probability and the impact of the risk. So probability talks about the chance that the risk could happen, while impact talks about what will be the monetary implication of the risk if eventually it happens. So our risk exposure, which is RE, is our risk probability multiplied by the risk impact, and that's what we refer to as the risk exposure. So where risk probability is the likelihood that the risk or event could happen, the risk impact is the effect on the project objectives if a risk event eventually happens, and that's exactly what the impact refers to. So let's take a look at this example to further illustrate our point. Here we're asked to calculate the expected monetary value for the given work packages. So you have work package X, the probability that a particular risk can affect this is 25%, and then if it happens, impact will be a loss of $10,000. Then we have work package Y, probability that a particular risk event can actually affect it. Let's say weather, for example, is about 40%, and then if it happens, then the impact would be loss of $2,000. Then for work package Z, this is a positive risk, so you can see that the impact here is positive. And then the probability that we're going to get this positive risk, say for example a favorable government policy, is about 10%. So if it happens, then we're going to be $20,000 in the positive. So we now want to determine the expected monetary value. So the expected monetary value is simply a combination of the probability and the impact of the risk. So to calculate the expected monetary value is now a combination of the probability as well as the impact. So if we say this 25% multiplied by negative 10,000, that would give us $2,500. So of course, don't forget 25% is same thing as 0.25 when it comes to if we're using the decimal place, while 40% is 0.4 and 10% is 0.1. So this is 0.25, that's 25% times 10,000, which gives us 2,500. Then 0.4 times 2,000, this gives us negative 800. And then 0.1 times 20,000, which gives us $2,000. This is positive risk. So this is the individual expected monetary value for each of these work packages. And then at the end of the day, we now add up all the various, expected monetary value. And then, of course, what we're now left with is now the total of our expected monetary value. So in this case, it's going to be this negative 2,500 plus 800, which will give us negative 3,300. And then when we add $2,000 to negative 3,300, you get negative 1,300 as the remaining. So in this case, this is the remaining expected total expected monetary value, and that's exactly what we have here. So this now will now help us to decide whether we want to go ahead with this particular project or not, because this is now determined by the level of our risk threshold. So remember earlier on we were talking about various key terms we use in risk. So our risk threshold is basically the amount of risk we're willing to take. So let's say our risk threshold is $1,000. In other words, negative $1,000. So we're simply saying that any risk that is above this $1,000, we're not willing to take such a risk. So if that's the case, this is $1,300 negative. It means probably it's beyond our threshold. So it's either we take a look at how we can reduce this risk, or we totally abandon this particular project. So that's exactly what the risk threshold helps you to accomplish. So there are now various risk categorization of various categories of risk. Categories of risk basically talks about creating specific risk categories that will enable us to effectively manage our risk, and then also this would also help us, especially when it comes to risk identification. So one of the classifications for risk is we have what we call external risk. So external risk are risks that arise outside of the project due to external factors. For example, regulatory or governmental policies, subcontractors, suppliers, as well as environment. We also have internal risks. So these are risks that arise within the project. For example, funding, resources, prioritization. This is what we refer to as internal risk. Then there's also the technical risk. This is a risk that arise out of the technology being used. For example, requirements, technology, and then also quality. All of these are what we refer to as technical risk. And then also another risk categorization is now what we call project management risk. This is basically a risk that arises out of the project management activities. For example, estimating, planning, schedule, and then also communication. Don't forget that most of the things we do in project management comes at the level of forecast. Forecast is basically an estimate. So that in itself also contains some level of uncertainties, because you never can tell. Things can actually change almost immediately. For example, we had the pandemic in the year 2020, which significantly changed the course of event, and then of course affected practically every industry. So notice that this is a typical example of what can affect your project estimate. So that's why we said that even in project management, all of those estimates we make for time planning, scheduling, all of that also constitutes what we refer to as project management risk. Okay, now risk can also be categorized or classified using other bases. Maybe, for example, basis of their origin. So you can have scope risk, resource risk, schedule risk, cost risk, quality risk. So this is also another way to categorize risk. The essence of this categorization is because it makes your risk identification easier for you, and then makes it a bit more straightforward and possible for you to do a comprehensive risk identification and then subsequently risk analysis. So when it comes to project costs and how you now need to make available your estimate or your contingency to address risk, we have what we refer to as various risk reserves, and this is typically how your cost rolls up in project. If you remember, we started by creating a work breakdown structure, and we said that the work breakdown structure stops at the level of what we refer to as work packages. Work packages are the smallest elements of your WBS. That's what we mentioned earlier on. So, and then these work packages are now broken down into activities, which is what we saw during project schedule management. So we now estimate the cost of these activities, which was what we saw under project cost management. So estimating the cost of these activities gave us our activity cost estimate. This is our activity cost estimate. So that's exactly what we have here. So this talks about small assigned project tasks. So cost for this assigned project task is your activity cost estimate. So this activity cost estimate is now rolled up into your work package estimates. So of course, the work package is the lowest level of your work breakdown structure. So this is essentially where you have your work package estimate, which is how much each of these work packages will cost. Then remember we talked about control accounts. So work packages clubbed to manage costs. So if we now group these work packages together for the purpose of managing the cost of these work packages, that now represents our control account. And then aside from that, we now have our project estimate. So our project estimate simply refers to how much all of this will now amount to. So don't forget that this is our project. So let's assume there are other control accounts. Let's say there is also another control account here. All of these control accounts put together will now give us our project estimate. And that's essentially what happens at the project level. Then after that, we now talk about contingency reserve. So contingency reserve is now that additional provision we're now making to take care of what we refer to as known uncertainties. And that's exactly what your contingency reserve actually addresses. So this basically helps you address your known uncertainties. And then of course your project estimate as well as your contingency reserve will now come together to make up your cost baseline. So this is the project cost for budgeting. In other words, a combination of this contingency reserve as well as your project estimate that now rolls up to give you what you refer to as your cost baseline. So the cost baseline is now what is released or made available to the project manager, and this is now the basis upon which you're going to track project performance. And then of course at the last level you now have management reserve. So management reserve now talks about another set of reserve put in place by management in order to address what we now refer to as unknown uncertainties. So these are risks that hitherto we were not able to identify, and nobody could ever think about the fact that such a risk might emanate. These are what we now refer to as unknown uncertainties, and that's typically where management reserve comes in. So management reserve is typically not within the purview of the project manager. So of course it's typically utilized when project is running over budget. So you have a reserve which you can finance the over budget, and then also to take care of some other risk which of course we're not able to identify earlier on in the project. That's one key thing that management reserve actually addresses. So under the project risk management, remember, we're going to be taking a look at all the processes that will enable us conduct risk management planning, identify, analyze, and then also respond, as well as monitor risk. All of these are part of all the things we do under risk management. So notice that the key objective of risk management is to increase the probability and impact of positive events, and then also decrease the probability and impact of negative events. And that's exactly one key thing that we take a look at when we talk about risk management. So this is where we come to the end of the part 1 of this particular lesson on project risk management. So in part 2, we shall be taking a look at the processes that we have under project risk management, one after the other, and then we shall also talk about their ITTOs, that's their input, tools and techniques, as well as output. I hope this particular lesson has been very informative for you. Once again, thank you for